Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he's bewildered that the card Flick a Coin doesn't require you to flip a coin. It's Matt Morgan.
One time I was on a date and it wasn't going that well. And really, she said, "It's kind of weird that you listen to so much Sister Hazel." And I said, "Well, it's hard to say what it is I see in you. I wonder if I'll ever be with you."
Matt, not gonna lie.
Wow.
There it is. Okay, Dana knows what you're talking about, but I don't.
It's a Sister Hazel lyric from the song All For You.
That was a deep cut.
That was the deepest of cuts.
Okay. Up next, you've heard his voice. He thought that flick a coin would require you to flicker a coin, so he's been exiling a penny and then putting it back onto the battlefield. It's Dana Roach. Dana, I'm so glad that you got Matt's joke.
I probably should have brought this up off air, but that sponsorship application we put in for the sunscreen company fell through. I will probably just reapply every 3 or 4 hours.
That one I could see coming. That one I got. I'm like on half a
Most
wavelength
Hazel
here.
reference was over your head. Yeah.
I mean, like Sister Hazel said, finally I figured it out, but it took a long time. It applies to Joey, that one.
Oh, man. I suspect that in this episode there will be a lot more lyric references that are going to go right over my head. The audience will have many chances to laugh at my expense. Thank you for bringing that to them, Matt. Oh, no.
I mean, it's kind of like the Avril Lavigne songs. Like sometimes they go and make it complicated.
There it is. Yeah. See, this one I get. All right. What does that say about me? Anyway, Dana, what are we talking about in this week's episode, dude?
We are going to be talking here about cards that bamboozle you, which I think you just wanted to use the term bamboozle. It was the main impetus for this show, I think.
Kinda, yeah. These are just some cards that are brain-breaking every so often. Like some things that are just hard to remember or hard to play with or hard to play around during games because there's something about them that just slips your mind sometimes. And we want to investigate why, which cards those are and maybe even what we can do about it. But yeah, I also just wanted to say the word bamboozle. But before we get into that topic, we got some shout outs to do first.
We're excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. We use their products long before our partnership because they just work. Other sleeves can be sticky or rough, and Matt would struggle sometimes to turn his creature sideways. But not with Ultimate Guard katanas. They've got buttery smooth action on your playmat, and turning them 90 degrees is just minimal effort on your part. It's a top-notch product, and their prices are more than reasonable, and we can't recommend them enough.
Absolutely cannot recommend them enough. Jana, you are right. It does help turn them sideways. So much easier. Best sleeve to turn sideways on the market.
Sideways in the Sidewinder deck box that they've got even. Hey-o, I'm learning how to do dad jokes.
Nice.
That joke was solid as a boulder. But anyways, if you would like to support the show directly, there's lots of ways that you can do that. You can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast. You can do that if you really felt so moved, but there's lots of free ways you can support us too. You can like and subscribe to this video on YouTube, subscribing to a local podcast app, leaving a review. Those all are great ways that you can support us. Doesn't cost you anything more than a couple seconds, which we definitely appreciate all that. But if you are so moved to go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, there's all sorts of perks you can get for yourself as well while also supporting the show. You can get access to our Discord community, which is always popping off. There's game finding channels. There's always games that folks are playing. It's just a great little community over there that we have going on there. There's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the coveted weekly patron shout out, which this week there is no name sweeter than Kyle Sweeten. We really sweetened up that joke. Not too bitter about that one.
No,
Kyle, I'm sorry for that one. I've just bamboozled Joey.
Just left a sour taste in all our mouth, Matt.
Yeah, Dana, that joke hit a little sweet and low. That was a nice little punchline.
All I've got to say is that, oh man, Kyle's a patron? That's sweet.
You should sweeten up that punchline. That was a little weak. A little bitter.
Yeah, I'm still learning how to dad joke, you guys.
That's fair. It's not for everyone. The life is not for everyone.
It's an acquired taste and an acquired skill. It's a thing that you've had to hone over many years of repetition and discipline. I understand.
Yep. But who didn't have to practice? Kyle Sweeten. Thank you for just derailing everything about this little shout out section. But thank you also for the support. We definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, seriously, so much. Okay, guys, let's get into our topic here now. Talking about some cards that bamboozle you. And to quickly set some parameters here, we're not just talking about cards that are confusing or weirdly worded. Like, Wheel of Misfortune is famously a card that's difficult to parse. Cards like Dead Ringers, when people say reading the card explains the card, I will show them Dead Ringers and I'll be like, are you sure about like that's just a confusing card. That's not entirely what we want to focus on here. We're going to talk about some cards that are like actually kind of hard to play around, not even because they're necessarily too complicated, but they rewrite rules sometimes, or they just do things that are a little bit unusual in ways that make you interact with Magic differently, and that means that they're kind of easier to forget. And they're also not even that unusual to see in games. Like, some of these are actually really, really good, but they still can cause some issues that you're just like, oh, wait, what? Some of those moments that can still sometimes crop up. So real quick, that's a thing that we're going to be talking about in this episode. Not just that these cards are confusing, but the way that you play around them, it's like suddenly your brain is stumbling a little bit.
The one that kind of jumps out at me here that I used to run in personally because I had a friend of mine who played the deck was Doran the Siege Tower.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who have forgotten, because Doran's a pretty old card, Doran is a legendary creature, a tree folk shaman who's a 0/5, and Doran just says each creature assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. That's relatively straightforward, and whenever you see Doran decks are running a lot of tree folk for the most part, or just a lot of different creatures that have like much larger butts than they do fronts, because those big butts deal damage in a way that they don't normally do. The problem, and I guess I use that term loosely, is it says all creatures, not just each creature you control. It says each creature assigns damage that way.
Yeah.
And the Doran player, number one, they built the deck so they know that their creatures are doing it that way. But like they've also built the deck with that in mind. They have creatures that are skewed to have toughness that are a high number, so they deal damage. You haven't built your deck that way. So like there's no necessarily visual reminder for you that happens. Even if you're aware that Doran works that way, which a lot of people aren't, even when you're aware of it, it's very, very easy to forget that also inverts your creatures because you're just not used to playing them that way, and they don't look like they would be working that way.
I unfortunately had to find out the hard way how Doran works because I used to play against the deck. There was a player in our play group. They had a Doran deck, and I played Valduk Keeper of the Flame for a long time, and that's just a mono-red aggro, make things go big, but also makes a bunch of 3/1s, which have trample and haste. Well, with Doran at the table, unfortunately, I got to experience my 3/1s only dealing 1 damage with trample, which, I mean, it's trample. That's not going to matter at all. No. But like all of the equipments that I was playing that souped up Valduk, they also were pumping its power. And so I very much found out the hard way that Doran is a universal effect. It works for every creature on the battlefield. And man, that was not a fun game by any means.
Oh, no. And that's just it. Like, you read the card and you're like, okay, cool. I can absolutely, like, it makes sense. But then you're in a game and you're actually playing and you're looking at your hand and you're looking at your field and you'll, like, somehow that information will just slip right out of your brain because you expect a person's own cards to work on just their own stuff. Maybe is kind of the feel. It's like when they changed slivers to only slivers you control are a thing. It just sort of feels like that is the regular pace of design lately, that you kind of forget that like actually a bunch of old cards have these global effects that will affect everybody, and keeping track of all of those and distinguishing which ones just affect a person's own stuff versus everyone's stuff, it starts to add up when there are, 20 permanents in play during a commander game.
Yeah, Lord of Atlantis is another version of this where if you're playing the, back in the day, the Merfolk mirror match in playing Modern, you had to sometimes cut your Lords of Atlantis because they buffed your other opponent's Merfolk, and that was not something you wanted to be doing. So there's all sorts of different, and they printed a fixed version of that later on. But yeah, having Lord of Atlantis type of effects too, gotta watch out for those.
I mean, yeah, Matt, I've run into this with my zombie deck. Like, most of the zombie lords that I play just say zombie creatures you control get +1/+1, but Lord of the Undead says all zombies get +1/+1. And even more comically, I've actually run into this with the card Noxious Ghoul in my zombie deck, which says whenever Noxious Ghoul or another zombie enters the battlefield, all non-zombie creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. That isn't just under the battlefield under your control. Whenever any zombie enters. So if someone plays a changeling, or in a game that I played against friend of the show, Aaron Radney, he had a God Eternal Oketra in play, which makes 4/4 black zombie warrior creature tokens with vigilance whenever you cast creature spells. So anytime that Aaron cast a creature, he also made a zombie, which then triggered my Noxious Ghoul, which took us a bit to catch that was actually happening, because it's just not a tempo of game that we usually get to experience. So it was very like, wait, what? For everyone at the table.
Yeah, the inconsistency is what tends to make this difficult. Like, you want to default to assuming that all of these effects work a certain way, and they don't. You do really have to check to make sure that you don't, that it works the way you think it does and doesn't affect everything versus your stuff, for sure.
Well, Dana, I think you've written down Urza's Incubator here, a 3-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, and creature spells of the chosen type cost 2 less to cast. Again, we'd expect that's only my stuff, right? But if you name a creature type that's popular enough, like, I don't know, you say humans or something like that, that's going to be everyone's humans. It's all creature spells of the chosen type, not just yours, which is, again, just the kind of thing that could easily pass you by.
Mm-hmm. And again, changelings. Like, there's a lot of changelings that see played in Commander these days, and they will have the creature type of the appropriate one for his Incubator.
And I mean, even for Coat of Arms, we talk about all the time, it affects every creature out there, not just your own.
And this one, I guess, isn't really something that bamboozles you. It's just like Ancestral Mask is an enchantment that buffs your creature based on the number of enchantments in play. It's not the enchantments you control. It's the number of enchantments in play, too. So like, this is one that I frequently see people play, like, oh, all right, I'm going to swing at you for, 18. It's always absurd anyway, but like, well, technically you're hitting me for 26 because you didn't count that person's land tax and, this wild growth over here and whatever. So like, that's a really easy one to miss as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just accidentally global cards that you have to distinguish, and that sometimes takes a couple extra seconds to parse. Yeah. Wait, which things are doing what when you're actually in the heat of battle during a game?
Mm-hmm. Well, here, so we talked about a card that bamboozled me playing Valduk, but here's a card that I really, really love that's in my Valduk deck because I like playing it myself. That card is Invasion Plans, and we've kind of mentioned it a couple times here and there over the few years. But Invasion Plans absolutely is so hard to wrap around. So it's 2 and a red for an enchantment that says each creature blocks whenever able. But the confusing part is attacking players choose how each creature blocks. So it completely flips how everything kind of plays out during the combat step. Because it's not really intuitive to lose control of your blockers. It's something you can just place down and then, you are going to block everything, but you're going to block like all the same creature. So annoying, so hard to wrap around sometimes.
Well, especially because the two clauses seem like they kind of fight against one another. In almost every situation where you see attacking player chooses how creatures block, which isn't that often, but it does come up, that usually means you choose to have them not block. Mm-hmm. Almost every time that pops up on a game, except for that the first clause fights against that. All creatures block each combat if able. So you don't get to choose that everything skipped through portion. You have to assign blockers in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, that's, again, it's just not something that there's templating you usually don't see in the you get to choose the blockers, combined with templating you usually don't see, which is that they're forced to block. It's a really bizarre card.
And it literally, it feels like I'm playing Magic wrong when this card is in play. Like the attacker is choosing the blockers. I feel like fundamentally something about the universe is off kilter when, Matt, you put this card down. Yeah. But it is such an effective card in your deck because you're making those extra elemental tokens and then forcing the creatures that I play to then be sacrificial fodder for your token so that your commander can damage on through and deal a whole bunch. Like, that is an amazing removal spell in your deck, basically, because you're constantly forcing me to throw a valuable creature that I just played in front of these things that just don't matter so that you can just like murk me with your commander damage, which is great. It's such a good card in that deck. But when I play it, or rather when I play against it, I'm like, what? I like, my brain is so off that I'm like, I don't engage with Magic in this way, and that's what makes me feel, bamboozled. That makes me literally be like, how I don't actually know how to play Magic when it looks like this. When people are able to Yu-Gi-Oh! And choose my creature will attack your creature, basically. It feels like I'm playing the wrong game. And that's the thing. It's not that this is a chaos card. It's not that the card is confusing. It's that when I play it, I'm like, can I even cast creature? No, my creature's gonna die. That is the moment for me that I'm just like, I've been like suddenly upended into a different universe of card game.
Yeah, thinking of it as a removal spell is absolutely a great way to approach it too, because especially when you combine it with Death Touch creatures, if you're playing, some sort of Gruul or Rack Rakdos where you have a lot of death touching creatures, you want people to make blocks. Okay, well, I don't want to block with this creature because it's valuable to me in some other way. And so forcing them to block with that creature and then assigning combat damage to it, like, it is a great way to just have an onboard removal spell. And then two, it's going to affect other players. You know, player B and C, they can attack each other and it's not going to affect you, but like, you're the one causing all that chaos to happen. So it is a fun little controlled chaos type of spell. I love this card.
Yeah, and that's certainly why it shows up the most in commanders like Ib Halfheart, which when your stuff gets blocked, you blow it up, or General Marhaltel's Dragon, which when your stuff gets blocked, your stuff gets bigger, so you're forcing those things to happen even more. Man, like, there are great applications for these cards. These are the types of cards that you'll probably see that in one of those decks if you play against it. So be prepared, because your brain is going to go blah.
Well, in a similar vein, and probably even more obscure, is the enchantment Raging River, also in red. And that does a thing that nothing else really does. Your opponent takes their creatures and basically separates them into two different groups. And then you choose which one of those groups are able to block which one of your creatures. They still will assign blockers afterwards, but like, you are functionally picking one group of creatures goes on one side of the river, one goes on the other, and you then decide which one of those sides of the river your creatures are going down, which nothing else does an effect like that. And then on top of it, it doesn't apply to flyers. So there's just a lot of nonsense that occurs with this one enchantment that we have not seen since way back in Unlimited. So like, the odds of you running into it short of playing my Agnes deck are pretty low. But yeah, that's nothing else is doing what that card is doing in this game, and it requires a lot of understanding what's going on because it breaks the game rules more or less.
Literally the best way I've heard you describe this card when you cast it, Dana, is like, it's fact or fiction for blockers. Like, that is the best way to try and parse what this thing does. But then it's also, again, it only counts without flying. But yeah, trying to read not only the text on the card, but also the Oracle text to try and, it's like when you try to read the Oracle text of Animate Dead, where you're like, this is a lot of words to explain what actually could be a very simple concept, but that's just how Magic rules be sometimes. And yeah, this throws off blockers in a pretty major way. And it's again like, what do I do? What do I do when this thing's in play?
Yes.
And you know what? Frankly, tokens that can't block is also a thing I'd probably put in, as long as we're here talking about combat, right? Like, might tokens and decayed tokens. The Micro Tyrant makes those fungus tokens that can't block. Wild's Drain had rat tokens that can't block. Actually, like, as long as we're talking about combat and things that make blocking tricky, I think those are also sometimes a thing that I see players kind of trip up a little bit. Because when you're playing against those, it just looks like across the battlefield there are a bunch of bodies in play. It doesn't look like a board that you can actually successfully attack through when there are a bunch of like decayed zombies in play, for instance. You just see a bunch of bodies. And that kind of short circuits the brain a little bit. And so we automatically assume that like, oh, that battlefield is super crowded. So that's actually another thing that I think sometimes can trip people up, that can kind of bamboozle players. Because you actually do sometimes have very safe attacks against players like that. But it doesn't look like it based off of what everything else in Magic games usually looks like.
Yeah, a lot of times for this kind of stuff, there's some kind of a signifier. Over the years, we've had a lot of illusionary creatures, and those get destroyed or sacrificed when they're targeted by anything. And that kind of makes sense in terms of being an illusion as well. But like, when you see that term, something is an illusionary dragon or an illusionary bear or whatever, very often that's telling you that that's what's going to happen when you interact with it. With things like this that can't block, there's nothing specific about them that tells you that's going to be the case. Is this a rat that can block or can't block? Well, you better have to look on the card to verify that, because, or the card that makes it. That isn't even a card. It isn't a card itself. It's a token. So like, you have to look at the source of the token to see if it's actually one of those things that can block or can't block.
I mean, that's the whole reason so many people build token decks too, is, I will always have blockers. I can chump block for days. And making tokens that can't block. I personally wouldn't really gravitate towards that, but that's just me. But I hate having to worry about, well, do these tokens block or not? And keeping track of tokens sometimes, if you're not using infinite tokens or some other like really handy tool, can be hard enough as is.
Yeah, that's just it. Especially with these tokens that do have these extra special like negative downside clauses, if they're not being represented with an infinite token that clarifies it, we've drawn on that. Infinite tokens are so great. Or if you have the token itself that says this creature can't block, it might just look like any old token, which is sort of an extra thing. So like being extra diligent about some of these is pretty important, I would say. And Dana, you mentioned illusory creatures, things that like when you target them, they have to be sacrificed. Phantasmal Image is a really famous and very popular example of this. But I would say that there's actually also a brand of illusion-causing effects, like Dismiss into Dream or Hirobi, that probably fit into this. It's just a natural segue off of something you just mentioned there, where they make everything illusory.
Yeah, it just turns your thing into something that can't be targeted, and you have to know that and remember that while you're playing in terms of like how you interact with your own stuff.
I want to equip a Lightning Greaves to my commander, but if I do, Dismiss into Dream says that I will lose my commander.
Yeah.
When these things are in play, I think I just like, I don't know if what's the opposite of decision paralysis? I'm like, oh no, I can't, what do I do? It again changes the way that I'm used to engaging with the game. And that's a frustrating thing. It's not that the card is complicated, but it is just like, I don't know what to do in games when this is in play, aside from hope to find some removal for those things, which it's just, it's a really, these are cards that can absolutely throw your opponents off because they will change the way that you are used to engaging with Magic.
Yeah, well, there's lots of cards that, man, they put a lot of trickery on the board. I know one thing, it's not a card that used to bamboozle you, but just how we used to transition into challenge of stats. That was one thing that we liked to bamboozle you with.
Wow.
I figured, since we're talking about bamboozling, especially that word specifically, I figured it's fun to bring it up every now and then, I guess.
Matt, during Pride Month, you do this to me? I can't believe you.
I do apologize for the timing, but it's on topic, I guess.
Oh, no, it's perfect. Are you kidding? But yes, let's move into Challenge the Stats, because there's a bunch of data on EDHREC that we don't agree with. So let's talk about some cards that are maybe over or underplayed. Matt, you're a gem. I adore you.
I do what I can.
My challenge this week is for the card Tolarian Contempt, which is a card that a lot of people probably missed from March of the Machines Aftermath. It's an enchantment for 3 and double blue, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a rejection counter on each creature your opponents control, and at the beginning of your end step for each opponent, choose up to one target creature they control with rejection counter on it, and that creature's owner puts it on the top or the bottom of their library. That's a really solid way to basically reject your opponent's creatures, kick them back to the top of their library or bottom. It's going to trigger at the end of the turn in which you cast it, so it isn't one of those things where you have to wait a full turn. It's going to start kicking in pretty much immediately. And because it puts the card in the top or the bottom of their library, it's either gone for good or they're going to lose their draw next turn. That's really, really effective, and I think people miss this card in general because it was in that Aftermath set. But I think what's especially a place this card should see more play is in Cross Defense Contractor decks. Cross functions in a way where it says whenever you put one or more counters on a creature you don't control, tap that creature and goad it. So one of the downsides to Tolarian Contempt is you can only get rid of one creature of each of your opponents per turn. That's still that's pretty effective. But what works nice with Cross is the ones you don't get rid of gain trample and are no longer attacking you. So while you wait to eject them from the board, they're hitting other people that aren't you. Contempt's a really solid card. It's really, really good in cross decks. It's only seeing play in about a third of them, or less than a third of them now. If you've got a cross defense contractor deck, consider Tolarian Contempt. You probably missed it because it just got missed, and it's a really good card in that deck.
Fun fact, Tolarian Contempt is also what happens when you attack the professor from Tolarian Community College and then he gets mad at you.
No one wants to deal with that.
Yeah, this is an interesting challenge. And you're right, Data. I had not heard of this card at all.
Yes.
So, yeah. All right. I am going to move to our listener submitted challenge now. And this one comes to us from our Discord patron, Alta Biscuit, who wanted to talk about the card Dawn of the Dead, which is not only a good movie, it's also a very, very interesting enchantment here. I don't know if it's a good movie. I have not actually seen it. Dawn of the Dead is a 5-mana black enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life, but also at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target creature card from your graveyard into play. That creature gains haste until end of turn, and then you remove it from the game at the end of turn. Couple of downsides that there appear to be on Dawn of the Dead. The thing is that exile it at the end of the turn clause that trigger at the end step, there are a lot of ways to avoid that, which is why, the most popular commander to play Dawn of the Dead right now is Obeka, Brute Chronologist. It will, in response to that trigger, you can just tap Obeka, end the turn, you'll exile that trigger, you'll get to keep your creature. The other thing, though, is that you can sacrifice the creature. And this isn't like Unearth, where the creature would get exiled anyway. You can actually just sacrifice the creature to a Viscera Seer or to Alta Biscuit's specific challenge here in an Ayara deck, where Ayara herself can tap to sacrifice your creature, and it'll go right back to the graveyard, where then on your next turn, Dawn of the Dead is going to let it get right back into play once again. So Alta Biscuit points out this is a great way to reuse very classic payoff cards in Ayara decks, such as Great Merchant of Asphodel, Abhorrent Overlord. Dawn of the Dead is a really, really cool card that has a couple of clauses on it that look a little bit scary, but the gradual value that you can get from this thing if you do something as simple as have some sacrifice outlets, which it's a graveyard deck, you're gonna have those already. This is a really great pick for some of those decks, and I especially love the suggestion here for it showing up in AR decks. It's only currently in 26 of the 3,700 AR decks that exist right now. Alta Biscuit, I'm with you. This should absolutely show up in more of those decks. Give Dawn of the Dead a look. Great challenge, Alta.
Well, and I'll wrap us up then this week with my challenge. So I recently was doing some updating in my decks. Yes, you heard that right. I was updating decks. Joey, Dana, you're welcome for staying up to date.
So proud of you.
But Ukima and Khazir is one of my favorite decks. It's a Sultai +1/+1 counters, where Khazir is the green part of it, where it puts +1/+1 counters whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player. And then Ukima Stalking Shadow can't be blocked and then has a leaves the battlefield trigger. It's a great target to put a ton of +1/+1 counters onto. The deck is all about putting counters on there. And if you look at the typical deck, there's a lot of super evasive creatures. There's Slitherblade. There's creatures that can't be blocked or have really good forms of evasion, like Cold Eye Selkie. And then a bunch of cards that are going to put +1/+1 counters onto all the creatures. And a card that's kind of surprising to me that people are still playing at a pretty decent percentage is Herald of Secret Streams. So Herald is 3 and a blue for a Merfolk Warrior. It's a 2/3 that says creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them can't be blocked. Well, if you look at the typical deck, most of those creatures are evasive already, whether they have Island Walk or just outright can't be blocked. There's a lot of reasons you are just not going to need Herald of Secret Streams. In theory, yes, it does work if you're putting a bunch of +1/+1 counters onto, say, Avenger of Zendikar tokens or anything like that. That's when Herald really works, but for the most part, people seem to be putting a lot of already evasive creatures into the deck and then putting a bunch of counters on them afterwards. Not the other way around, where you need the counters to make them evasive. So I don't really love Herald of Secret Streams anymore in Ukima and Khazir decks. 26% of players are still putting that into their decks. I just don't think you really need it. You're already playing a bunch of evasive creatures. Now, like I said, there are certain decks that maybe the way you're building it do want that. If you're playing Avenger Zendikar, other creatures, or just a density of creatures that don't have evasion. But otherwise, I don't really think you need Herald of Secret Streams. So 26% seems too high in those decks, especially because, why would you put any counters on anything other than your commander anyways, which already can't be blocked? That's just me, though, having played the deck for a few years.
Also, this is one of those cards that if you just put a comma into it, you'd accidentally have a legendary creature. Herald, of Secret Streams would be a great name for a legend.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe they still do it. There's still unsets that are going to be made in the future, probably.
I'm rooting for you, Harold. I'm rooting for you. Okay, guys, we're going to get back into our main topic here, talking about some of those things that just sometimes bamboozle you. And I think now's the appropriate time for us to talk about memory problems. There are sometimes memory issues that can come up during a game. The specific cards that I'll name here as I think quintessential examples of it are Noble Heritage, and also the Second Doctor is another good recent example. Noble Heritage is a really neat background that can do some cool stuff with your commander. The effect is actually very powerful, but it sometimes causes some memory problems. So bear with me for a minute while I read this monster of a text box. Commander creatures you own have, when this creature enters the battlefield and at the beginning of your upkeep, each player may put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control. For each opponent who does, you gain protection from that player until your next turn. So already we have to know, what does protection do? But this is also a thing that okay, cool, it's an until your next turn effect, and the only signifier of something happening is a couple of +1/+1 counters. But even if the creature wearing those counters dies, you will still have protection from that player. And this is a thing that I see people mess up a lot. That like, yeah, oh, I'll take the deal. And then on their next turn, they will try and attack the person who they took the deal from. But it's like, I have protection from you. Like, those types of memory issues come up a lot. And frankly, the card, the Second Doctor, also has similar things. Like, did you take my deal? Cool, then don't attack me on your next turn. But people just sometimes forget these things. Do Commander players have a memory issue? This is kind of what I want to explore here. I think these also are bamboozling cards.
Yeah, it's one of those things you sometimes see crop up where it's a difference between goading creatures or goading creatures target player controls, which is, I believe, what Carter does. So you have a situation there where even if the creatures aren't necessarily in play at the time that the original goad happens, they still get goaded on their turn, assuming that they have haste, because of it's the player who has the effect put on them versus the creatures. And there's an inconsistency there because it sometimes, or most of the time, works the other way, where it's the creature specifically being targeted. So yeah, you have to, like, number one, be aware of the inconsistency, and number two, remember the thing that happened, because there's nothing on the field that's basically indicating that's what's going on.
Yeah, well, in Noble Heritage especially, because it's protection from that player that you get as if you're the person who has the Noble Heritage. I think people just forget, what does protection stop anyways, whether it's targeting, whether, yes, you actually can attack the person that has protection from you. You're just not going to deal any damage. And so there's all sorts of different things that kind of get rolled up into Noble Heritage specifically. I think there's a lot of layers to that card that kind of help make it as bamboozling as possible.
Well, and Dana, to your goad point, you mentioned Cardor, but like, we colloquially say that Cardor is goading, but the thing that makes Cardor that exception is that it doesn't goad. So like,
right, yes.
And so like, that's the tricky part. It is affecting the player rather than their creatures, as you said, but like, that is an extra thing on top of it, is that like, oh, wait. And one more thing with goad, especially, as long as we're here on that, goad also means that you can't attack planeswalkers, which is another thing that I sometimes see, like, people forget. But like, yeah, they're forced to attack a player other than you, a Fable, which means they have to attack a player.
Well, as to Matt's thing about having to know how protection works, I guarantee, once every calendar year, we all hear somebody who has a creature wearing a sword say, does protection from white stop that board wipe? Like, no, it's not damage. It's just destroying it, and it's not targeting it. It's just because it's you need to know the intricacies of how protection works to know that, which is one of the reasons you don't see protection very often anymore. But there's a lot of memory issues with this stuff for sure.
It's almost like protection is a complicated mechanic anyways, and so putting more labor on remembering all those different layers, it's obviously like why players kind of get overwhelmed when they're first learning the game. Like, oh my gosh, there's so much that you have to remember. Why would I want to do this? And so, yeah, I can't blame players for kind of getting overwhelmed sometimes.
Well, that's just it. There are so many things to keep track of already on a battlefield. Like, Commander is the most complicated way to play Magic. There are so many of you, and there are so many different things doing a bunch of different stuff, and they're doing it in different ways as well. We talked about those things that, are these cards global, or do they only affect your own stuff? And so then having another layer of a thing that like lasts for a full round, several rounds, but it doesn't have an actual material thing on the field to remind you of that fact, does kind of like require a little bit of extra effort during those games. So I get it. Like, there are so many things happening in a game of Commander that these things can just be hard to keep track of, and they will absolutely trip you up.
Well, another thing too that just kind of goes in line with what we were talking about with memory issues, Red's impulse draw is great, and it's one thing that we very much appreciate about kind of the developments in Red card draw. But why do they have to always keep changing when the impulse draw expires? Because every other card, oh my goodness, every other card seems to just back up and flip around. So you have cards like Ren's Resolve and Light Up the Stage, which are great. I love those cards. I play both of those cards, which exile cards until your next turn. But then there's cards like Brazen Cannonade, which exiles cards until combat on your next turn. Or Ecstatic Beauty and Commander Liar Porter, which exile cards until the end of this turn. So like, it's not out of the question to have like 3 separate piles that have 3 different expiration times of when you can play them. And I just wish they would, I wish they would keep everything in line, like unify that in some form or fashion, because that can be a lot of mental labor that players have to expel just to remember when they can play certain cards.
Yeah, and I do understand why they do it differently, because it does create different power levels. So like, maybe you want this common card to only let you use them till the end of this turn, whereas the mythic version of it, buys you an extra turn to cast those things. I do understand the logic there, but it'd be nice if there was some unifying way to recognize which one of the things did what thing. It's not quite the same thing, but like mentally, it's pretty easy to classify the difference between looting and rummaging, which is, I think, blue tends to be strongest in. The difference between drawing a card and discarding a card, or discarding a card and drawing a card. But there's terms for those, and sometimes you'll actually see them apply to the creature. It's a rummaging goblin, it's a looting merfolk, whatever. But it's not something you have to remember. You're just taking the action, so it's different. Whereas with the impulse draw, it's something you have to remember. Then you have to know the difference and like pay attention to where those things are going. And if you're playing a mono red deck, this is something that like you may have all of these different versions of this effect in the same deck. So you have to be aware of like, okay, this thing is doing this thing and this thing is doing that thing. And sometimes they might be stacked on the same turn. Yep. You might have on that same turn cast a Ren's Resolve that lets you use those cards until the end of next turn. And you may cast something else that forces you to use them this turn. And you like have to remember which exile pile expires when.
Yeah, they really chain into each other. I think you were saying that you've run into literally, I had one go into another, then they were all different timings on them in a single turn. I'm not surprised. And actually, I think it was just on a recent episode that we mentioned Headliner Scarlet, which does a similar effect. It has a different timing restriction, but it also does it face down. The card that you get is hidden from other people, which is great for the clue flavor that it was going for. It's like, ooh, a little bit of mystery. But that is, again, one more variation on it, which was just very funny to see.
Yeah.
Or just to, like, not to say like all these concerns aren't warranted, but let's throw one more wrench in the gears. How about a Tali that can only cast things right away after you exile them, and not you get to wait and play them later? Do we need any more options for when you can impulse
and
cast things out?
That's probably the most frequently played of these effects. A Tali I probably see more than any of the rest of these. So yeah, let's keep it different.
Well, actually, Matt, I'll do you one better. You know the card You Find Some Prisoners? Which it's a red instant. You choose one, you either destroy target artifact, or you exile the top 3 cards of an opponent's library. You choose one of them until the end of your next turn. You may play that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. So that's another variation on these as well.
We have like 6 different piles in this whole category of
for real
what these impulse draws are doing.
Yeah, it's terrific. On the subject of draw, to try and give you your brain a break from the different types of impulse draw, I'll actually go to a draw enchantment here that, Dana, you are famous for loving, and that's Psychic Possession, a fantastic blue dissension enchantment. You enchant an opponent, you skip your draw step, and whenever the enchanted opponent draws a card, you may draw a card. This feels really bad on you when you have stuff like Brainstorm in hand, because then you're just giving an opponent free 3 cards. But specifically why I wanted to bring this up is because it's not a difficult thing to remember, like some of the other stuff that we've mentioned. But when this is on you, what do you do? Like, seriously, what do you do? Do you not draw cards? Like, you're giving a bunch of free value to an opponent, but it does just like, it makes me reconsider every game action I'm about to take and the value engines I wanted to do when, Dana, you put this card on me. And not only that, but with this card, there was a wild moments from a Game Nights Live where someone cast a wheel spell. I think it was a Wheel of Misfortune. And genuinely, the entire crowd forgot that this Psychic Possession would draw Prof twice as many cards off of that wheel spell because the enchanted player was drawing and then the Psychic Possession would trigger as well. Like, it's a thing that is easy to just be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go forward with my game plan and not realize the damage that could do to your game plan. So this card's great. Dana, stop enchanting me with it.
Well, it has a little added twist too here. Like, it's frequently played in the blue-black Taigam commander where you're skipping your draw step anyway, so there's not a lot of downside to it, but not exclusively. So like, if you are playing it in a deck where you do have a draw step normally, then you have to remember that you're skipping your draw step. And I have a friend of mine who has the River Song deck where you draw from the bottom of your library, and I noticed he would take an Infinite Token and skip your draw from the bottom and put it on top of his library.
Yeah.
So actually, the last couple times I've played Psychic Possession, I've taken a little Infinite Token and written skip your draw step and put it on top of my library, so I don't forget that portion of it either. Because like, even as the person who plays it, you're so used to that like untap, upkeep, draw that it's a very easy mistake to make to grab that card.
Yeah, you're fighting against muscle memory. You're literally fighting against muscle memory at that point.
Yeah.
Just certain pathways that have been forged in your brain. And you know what, Dana, that was my message to you. But now I'll send a message to Matt about certain combat stuff. Matt seems like the kind of person who would potentially play a Marisi Breaker of the Coil, of the three of us.
Yeah.
Marisi Breaker of the Coil, fantastic Naya commander. But it also says your opponents can't cast spells during combat. And every time I've played against a Marisi deck, I have forgotten about this. I'm like, oh, I've got my fog. I feel so safe. Oh, no. Like that just,
oh, no, you don't. No, you don't have a fog, actually.
Yes.
At least not right now. You might some other combat.
Yeah, or I was actually just recently in a game as well where someone had a Teferi Time Raveler in play, which forces your opponents to only operate at sorcery speed. And I had a couple of tricks in hand. I had a second harvest to double up my tokens, which would then pump up my things that cared about how many artifact tokens. It would like pump them up. And I had a fleeting reflection in my hand. And I was like so excited that like mid-combat, I'd be able to burst in a bunch more damage. Except nope. I forgot about the Teferi. Like some of these things that change their timing restrictions are again the kind of things that it's easy to forget. You can literally lean over the table, read them out loud, and you're like, okay, I understand. And then 2 seconds later, your brain is just like delete, just like immediately into the trash and empty the recycle bin. That just happens sometimes in these games with cards like these.
Well, my good friend Max Crandall, who used to be on the Commander Central podcast with me, had a Dragonlord Dromoka deck, and Dragonlord Dromoka prevents your opponents from casting spells on your turn. Where the thing that really used to throw people in pods we would play against with that commander was someone would get it in their brain, okay, I have this Fact or Fiction in my hand, and before the end of Max's turn, before I start my turn, I'm going to use this Fact or Fiction. Max casts Dragonlord Dromoka, does a couple things, goes to end his turn, the person's like, before the end of your turn, I'm going to cast Fact or Fiction. He's like, no, you're not. You can't cast spells on my turn. Because Dromoka wasn't in play when you got it in your brain that I'm going to do this action at the end of the turn. And then even though Dromoka comes down and you know it won't let you cast spells, putting those two things together is way more challenging than it should be. And I saw so many people, including myself, who knew it was a thing that would happen, would get caught up on that, get caught up on the instant speed thing they were saving to do at the end of turn, and would find themselves in a position where, oh, I just left that mana free and now I can't use it, despite having had an entire trip around the table to use it a bunch of times.
Yep.
Because it was in the head, I'm going to wait till the end of that turn to use it. That was a tough play pattern to break out of.
It's so funny when you mess with the timing of when people are able to do certain things, like how much that messes them up, whether it's like Grand Abolisher effects or anything like that.
Right.
There's all sorts of play that just, I would dare say it gives so many players decision paralysis when you take away their ability to do things when they were anticipating on how to do it.
Dolmen Gate and Reconnaissance are two cards that kind of change the way you interact with combat. Reconnaissance kind of gives you a pseudo-vigilance worst case, but like it also lets you just change your mind. Like, you decided to, I wasn't sure how you were going to block. You decided to block in a way that like, no thanks. I'm opting out of this. And Dolmen Gate just makes yourself not take damage. So like it lets you be way more reckless than you would used to be. And it affects you as a defensive player. People start making decisions that you weren't prepared to have them make. It just changes how you have to look at all these combat situations, which is really interesting, but it's not something that you're used to, and it requires you to change how your brain is processing all of this data.
Yeah, Dana, these are great. I use these cards. And Reconnaissance is especially tricky because you have to go through the song and dance of explaining that the card actually is lying to you. The reminder text on that card is like fully a lie, like because you can't activate it after combat damage has been dealt when the creatures are still considered attacking. So it's just, it's very, very fun. These are great cards. Like these are the types of cards that I do definitely see in games. And what I find weird about that, like I have found myself in situations where I'm still trying to block profitably when an opponent has one of these in play. I'm still trying to be like, all right, I'll block in this way that will destroy your creature, and it's only once the damage is dealt that I'm like, right, right, that doesn't matter. That actually doesn't, I can't defeat these attacking creatures at all. Obviously I can't, but it's the kind of thing that again, you just, maybe if you don't see it very often, it's just the kind of thing that your brain, it's easy for your brain to just like phase it out where it's not particularly there. And weirdly, I think if these cards just straight up said your attacking creatures have indestructible, I probably wouldn't forget it as much. Like maybe just the way that some of these are phrased. I don't know. So like, yeah, it's a thing. I'm not even saying that I forget like all the time. Like I think this episode actually is potentially self-incriminating. It's just like, wow, do these guys even know how to play Magic? They're missing all of these cards.
No, we do not. We just
But it's like these are things that take an extra second to calibrate, and when there are a lot of cards in play that take an extra second to calibrate, that's where these trip ups can, I think, occur most commonly. Is that like you have to do a couple of extra considerations for 40 things in play, and that's where it starts to be like, okay, I need a minute, and it's easy to make a non-optimal block against cards like these, for example. So it's why they're tricky, and also part of the reason why they're so good.
I mean, visually, some of the stuff can get really complicated too. I think the king of this is Questing Beast. There's so much text on that card, and not only is there a lot of text in that card, none of it has anything to do with the Questing Beast. Like, none of it is intuitive. Looking at the card and reading the name of the card, there's nothing to remind you of all those different lines of text and how it would function. So you have to, every time, even as someone who plays Questing Beast and I think 2 different decks, I still always have to double check because I don't remember all of the different things it does.
Not only that, but the fact that it's legendary sometimes slips me by, because the name is Questing Beast rather than the Questing Beast. Like, even down to that level, I'm like, what is happening?
Yeah.
And it also has that ability of damage can't be prevented, which is a thing that I think we encounter rarely enough, that like I could see myself still trying to like thinking that like protection or something will help me, and I don't know if it does. Does protection work? Like, oh my word, that card is a mess. Ugh.
Well, and you sometimes get this weird one too, and I know we've all ran into this before, where if it's a card you don't know that well and you're just looking at it, there's times when the art throws you off because you're like, is that creature flying?
Sure.
No, but it looks like it is.
Like Sovereigns of Lost Alara. Yeah, that creature totally has flying.
Right. Yeah.
Nylea with a bow doesn't have reach. Yeah.
Yeah. Every like random green bird that doesn't have flying and you're really sure it does. Like that's just one of those things that happens that you know, it's not like a frequent occurrence, but we all run into it once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Or, you know what, even cards that you do know really well, but they have niche things that you didn't, that almost never come up in a game. Like Howling Mine. We all know Howling Mine. Famous card, 85,000 decks playing it. Lovely group hug enabler, for example. At the beginning of each player's draw step, everyone draws an additional card, right? Except it says at the beginning of each player's draw step, if Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws a card. Because this harkens back to the time when artifacts either were turned on or off, depending on whether they were tapped or untapped. That almost never comes up, but there are decks that can manipulate that. You know, and Urza can tap this for blue mana, and that will shut off the card draw for your other opponents. You rarely see that happen, but it can happen, and that's messy sometimes. And so, like, this could be my own card in play, and I will sometimes miss that if someone happened to tap all artifacts or played like a blind obedience, making it enter tapped. I would forget this. I would probably just forget this. That like, oh yeah, it doesn't act right away because it is tapped. A thing that is almost never going to come up with this card, even though I have played it in plenty of decks and it sees lots of play.
Well, and not all of the versions have that reminder text on it as well.
Oh, is that true?
For example, the 6th edition.
Oh, like the really old ones.
Yeah, the old ones have, during each player's draw phase, that player draws an additional card. So yeah, not all of them do.
Dang. All right, well, yay, confusion.
Okay, so with all of those things said, though, about not just these cards, but everything we've talked about today, do you guys have any tips? Anything that you use specifically for whenever you're playing some of these cards that do tend to bamboozle yourself or other players? What do you do to keep things in mind to help you remember all of these and play with them a little bit better? Because the last thing anybody wants is when you're playing a card and you're playing it poorly and then just everybody else suffers.
So I think that I mentioned this talking about the skipping your draw step thing with Psychic Possession, but like I found myself taking notes more often on Infinite Tokens, just for things like that, like from, you know, just write something down. I did it just last week. I think I had a card with Retrace in my graveyard, and I just wrote RT on a token and stuck it in the side of my library, because it wasn't on the top of my graveyard anymore. I'm like, I had this thing with Retrace I might want to use, so like remind myself that I have a thing with Retrace in my graveyard. I think that's, if you've got the ability to just make little notes for yourself, take advantage of that.
Interesting. This is the thing that I do sometimes in just like my regular normal life. If like I have to remember I have an appointment at a certain time, or I have to take a medication at a certain time or whatever, to make sure that I don't forget to do it, I will sometimes say the thing aloud a couple of times, so that I'm not just remembering it, I'm also hearing it, and that might hopefully help it lodge in another part of my memory. So I think like actual regular memory hacks are something that I might have to do, like find some type of mnemonic of that type is maybe a thing I'll have to do, where I'll like, that Noxious Ghoul example comes up and that's all zombies. Okay, all zombies. I'm going to say that a couple of all right, this affects remember any zombie. There are cards that we shorthand in our brain sometimes, and we forget all of the little intricacies that they have. So even just repeating something aloud a couple of times might actually make it finally register at the forefront of your brain instead of just the back of your mind. So maybe that is another potential option as well.
Fair.
But those are tough. And it can, if you're just talking to yourself a whole lot, that can start to sound obnoxious during a game. But yeah, I think just actual memory hacks about improving your memory is a thing that I might have to start doing for some of these cards that I know I have difficulties with. Matt, do you have any tips?
I mean, you have a really good point about you don't want to be obnoxious about the ways you're remembering, because nobody wants to ask, do you pay the 1? Do you pay the 2? Do you pay the 1?
Right.
And so finding ways that are going to be effective for you, and yeah, just general memory tips. But I mean, I'll put things on top of my deck sideways or some sort of way to demarcate. Okay, this is going on here. Sometimes one thing that I really, really like about being part of Team Ultimate Guard for all of our sleeves is I can just use a dry erase marker and just scribble on things. So if I'm naming a card in secret, I can scribble on the sleeve itself.
Sure.
And that's just one of the big things that kind of combines both of you is I'm just making notes for myself on the cards themselves. So it's super nice to have all sorts of different tools around you, but just the fact that sleeves work with dry erase markers is such an enormous help when you're just trying to make anything going on.
I'll also say, if you can gamify certain memory issues, that helps a lot too. I think I've mentioned in the past, the times that I encounter that Noble Heritage background enchantment the most, I've got a friend who has a Noble Heritage, a deck where that is one of the commanders, one of the backgrounds. And it's actually kind of gamified because when people do or do not take the deal, they're giving out stuff that those Brazilian steakhouse coasters that are green on one side and red on the other as yes, I do or do not want more food. But in this case, it's yes, I did or did not take the deal. In which case that becomes a visual thing on the board that makes it a lot easier to point to or to immediately visually clock, yes, I did. And that will remind me, because there aren't always things that will allow you to immediately be oh, yes, indeed I did. Because some of these cards don't have, the Carters of the world or whatever don't have an actual thing on the battlefield that you can point to as yes, this is a consistent thing. I think literally when I had a Cardor deck, actually, I would take an Infinitoken and draw a Cardor on it and put that in the middle of my field to remind everyone that Carter's effect is happening that turn, that it was recently active and not just that Carter has been sitting there for a while. So finding ways to make them a little bit funny or a little entertaining is another way that you'll slip into those things naturally, and it won't feel like a pain to try and remember these things.
Yeah, any little hack you can do, I think you should do. There's no reason not to do those little things. Mm-hmm. And it can make a big difference for sure.
Yeah, like how we talked a few episodes ago about how when I play my Tom Bombadil deck and when I'm playing all these sagas, I have to have them lined out at a certain part of my playmat just to make sure I have all of these in mind. I'm at all given points of the game, no matter whose turn it is, I'm reassessing what's going to happen when these next sagas go on. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of just general self-helpy type of things you can be doing. And at the risk of getting into self-help, just finding ways that work for you is going to help you so much when it comes to all sorts of cards that do tend to confuse people or just are sometimes hard to play with.
Yeah. There are a lot of bamboozling cards. We didn't even get to a whole bunch of them. Especially in a chaos card out there, it'll literally be what does this do? But I think that's just a thing to remind ourselves, and not to feel bad about it, is that Commander is the most complicated way to play this game. So it's okay that some of these cards, it sometimes feels like a deck is smarter than you, but that means that's another challenge for us to rise to. And frankly, these cards are also really fun, which is why we're playing them. And part of the fun sometimes can be the bamboozling part of it too. So y'all, this has been so much fun. I'm really looking forward to any suggestions from listeners about cards that make their brain break a little bit. I'd love to read the comments on this one. Leave a review, tell us what your favorite bamboozling card is. But with that, I think we're going to call this episode to a close. So if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where can they find us? Matt, let's start with you.
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you need some of the best deck accessories for all of your cards, whether it's sleeves, deck boxes, anything like that, go to Ultimate Guard for the best out there.
And Dana?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz everywhere online. And you can also find the cast everywhere online at EDHRECast. And if you want to send us an email, maybe you've got a question about how the data on EDHREC works, or if you've got a challenge the stat submission you want us to see, you can contact us at edhrecast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.